Guys, this is Miss Ishmael, and today we're going to talk about biology and the characteristics of life. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, the first thing we need to talk about is the biosphere. All living things and all the places they are found on Earth make up what we call the biosphere. So the biosphere is essentially our planet. Every part of the biosphere is connected. So all of the biomes, which include the land and water, all of the plants and animals and other living things on our Earth are connected to one another. The variety of organisms that we find on our Earth and in a given area is called biological diversity or biodiversity. The word bio means life. So these are all the variety of organisms that we see on this planet. Generally, when we're looking at the Earth, there is more biodiversity near the equator and less biodiversity near the poles. And this is because generally more organisms can survive in warmer temperatures. Organisms that are closely related and can produce fertile offspring are known as a species. So these are all really important definitions to get us started talking about biology for the year. Now, every year, scientists discover nearly 10,000 new species. So there are tons of species of organisms on this planet that we haven't even discovered yet. Also, every year, scientists estimate that over 50,000 species are dying out or becoming extinct. So species are constantly evolving and changing. They are going extinct, and we're discovering new ones constantly. So the science of studying these living things and how they interact with their environment is what we call biology. And that's what we're going to be studying this year in class. Now, all living things have common characteristics that distinguish them from non-living things. And we call these common characteristics the characteristics of life. So there are 8 of them that we're going to talk about today. So let's start with our first one. The first characteristic of life is that living things are all composed of organizational units called cells. So everything alive must include at least one or more cells. Most cells can perform a variety of functions, and we associate these functions with life. So cells use energy, they reproduce, they grow, they respond to changes in their external environment, and cells are very diverse. So here we've got a couple different pictures of cells. So for example, this one is a sperm cell. Okay, this one is a blood cell. Here we have a neuron. And this one is a white blood cell. So each of these cells are going to do different functions. So the way that they're shaped, will determine what they do. And we'll learn more about that this year. So the second characteristic of life is that all living things must reproduce. So reproduction happens in a couple different ways. So your cells reproduce through a process called mitosis, which we'll talk about this year. And then your body, of course, reproduces and makes new offspring through sexual fertilization, which we see here in this picture with the sperm and the egg. So all living things have to reproduce in some way. Even bacteria reproduce. And that's what you're seeing right here. This is a process called binary fission, which is something else that we're going to learn about this year. Bacteria also reproduce just like humans, and that's why bacteria would be considered living as well. So reproduction can be either asexual or sexual. So sexual reproduction is what we do, where 2 gametes or 2 cells come together. Or reproduction can be asexual, which is what bacteria do, where 1 cell splits in half to become 2 cells. So we'll be learning about these types of reproduction this year in class. Okay, so the third characteristic of life is that all living things are based on a universal genetic code. And you've probably heard of this genetic code before. It's called DNA. All things that are living have DNA inside of them. Some viruses have a special type of nucleic acid called RNA instead of DNA. But viruses are not technically living, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about viruses this year. All right. So our fourth characteristic of life is that all living things must grow and develop. So this seems pretty obvious. Think about how much you've grown since you were born. Okay. We also grow and develop through different stages in our adolescence. So right now you're going through a development called puberty. As you get older, you go through other developmental stages as well. So we don't only grow taller or grow bigger, but our body develops and changes as we age. Our fifth characteristic of life is that living things must obtain and use materials and energy. So we obtain and use our energy through the form of food. So all of the chemical reactions taking place in your body, okay, to keep you alive require energy. And we get this energy through a process called cellular respiration. We'll be talking about cellular respiration later this year. Plants get their energy through a process known as photosynthesis. So both of these processes produce energy. Animals obtain their energy from food and it's broken down, while plants obtain their energy from sunlight. And we'll be talking about both of these processes this year in class. All right, let's move on to our sixth characteristic of life. Our sixth characteristic says that living things must respond to their environment. So anything in the environment that causes you to react is called a stimulus. The reaction that you do, okay, is called a response. So responses can be short-term or long-term, and they can be positive or they can be negative, okay? So reactions take place every day. So if I threw a baseball at you and you caught it, that's a stimulus, which would be the baseball, and the catching would be a response. So responses can be positive, meaning that you're going toward the stimulus. Okay, so here the plant is growing toward the sunlight. So that's going to be a positive response. Another example might be that I put chocolate chip cookies out in the lab. Okay, if you go toward those chocolate chip cookies, that would be a positive response as well. The opposite of a positive response is a negative response. This is when the organism moves away from the stimulus. So for example, roots in plants, okay, move away from sunlight. Okay, they grow down into the earth. So that would be a negative response. With you, a negative response might be if you touch a hot pan. Okay, you pull your hand away from it. Again, that would be a negative response because you're going away from the stimulus. All right. So our seventh characteristic of living things is that all living things must maintain a stable environment. So the ability to adjust and respond is very important because organisms must maintain a constant, stable environment. Okay, and we call this constant, stable environment homeostasis. Homeostasis is internal balance and it keeps us from getting sick. Our last characteristic of life is that all living things must change over time. Okay? So a population of organisms change over the course of generations. Okay? And we call this evolution. We'll be talking about evolution this year. And this doesn't always mean terms of large evolution, like animals changing from one form to another. But as we grow and we change and we evolve, those are short-term evolutions that we'll be talking about this year as well. All right. So those are our 8 characteristics of life. Let's review. Number 1 was that all living things are composed of cells. The second one is that all living things reproduce. The third one was that all living things are based on a universal genetic code, which we called our DNA. Okay. Living things grow and develop. Living things obtain and use energy. Living things respond to our environment. And living things can change over time. The very last thing I want to talk to y'all about today is the biological level of organization. All living things are organized, okay, in a pattern. So we know that everything on this earth is made up of tiny particles called atoms. So atoms would be our smallest biological level of organization. If we take atoms and arrange them in a certain way, we get molecules. So we're going to talk about several molecules soon, like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So these molecules are going to be essential, okay, for making up the rest of our body. These molecules can arrange themselves to form organelles. You've learned about organelles before. Organelles are parts of the cell. So they're the tiny little parts, like the mitochondria or the chloroplast or the nucleus. If you take a bunch of organelles and put them together, you make a cell. The cell is the smallest unit of life. All organisms, must be made of at least one cell. It's the smallest unit of life. If you take cells and you put them together and they perform the same job, we call that a tissue. So tissues are cells working together performing the same function. When tissues come together, they form our organs, like our heart, our kidney, our liver, our spleen, our lungs, and our muscles. When organs are working together, they form our organ systems, like our cardiovascular system, our respiratory system, our digestive system, and so on. And then when all of our organ systems come together, we call that an organism, which is an entire living being. Okay, so it's something that is alive. So these are our levels of biological organization, from smallest, which is the atom, to largest here, which is the organism. So we learned about quite a few things today. I hope that you've taken good notes, and I hope that this helped.